Hello, I'm Bill Bullard with R-CALF USA, the voice of the independent cattle producer in the United States of America. Well, on Saturday, January 16th of 2021, Yale Law School hosted a nationwide conference on big ag and antitrust. They invited academic researchers, law professors, economists, law students, and trade association representatives like me to submit papers describing the types of reforms needed in antitrust enforcement and in regulations to improve America's food systems. The conference was intended to serve as a focal point for academics, enforcers, policymakers, petitioners, and journalists. Christopher Leonard, former Associated Press reporter and author of the 2014 book, The Meat Racket, was the conference's keynote speaker, and he expertly made the case that number one, raising meat animals is the pillar of rural America, and number two, monopoly structures in meat animal markets can suppress prices paid to farmers and ranchers while raising prices to consumers. So his recommendation for how policymakers and regulators should address the concentrated marketplace that U.S. livestock producers now face is to end the consumer welfare experiment. So let's talk about that. In decades long gone, United States antitrust regulators viewed their role as defenders of marketplace competition. If two large marketing outlets for farmers and ranchers, say two large meat packers, wanted to merge into one giant meat packer, the regulators would look to determine if the merger would reduce competition to those very farmers and ranchers who relied on the two meat packers to receive competitive prices for their livestock. If the answer was yes, that the merger would reduce competition, then the regulators would take enforcement action to preserve competition by blocking the merger. And although U.S. antitrust laws like the Sherman Act of 1890, the Clayton Act of 1914, and even the Packers and Stockyards Act of 1921 remain largely the same, regulators beginning around 1980 began to buy into the arguments made by the merging conglomerates. Those merging conglomerates argued that even though their efforts to concentrate and consolidate the marketing outlets for farmers and ranchers would result in less competition, that should still be okay because consumers will be able to buy their food cheaper, which they claim is a result of economies of scale and greater efficiencies resulting from their mergers. In other words, regulators bought into the notion that increased consumer welfare, that is, cheaper prices for consumers, trumps reduced competition for farmers and ranchers, which means farmers and ranchers would receive lower prices for the livestock, and that was okay. Thus began the consumer welfare experiment that Chris Leonard said we now need to end. Throughout the 90s, the 2000s, and the 2010s, the consumer welfare experiment not only caused regulators to consistently ignore U.S. antitrust laws, but it also empowered agencies like the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, or USTR, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture, or USDA, which has a statutory duty to strengthen the U.S. family farm and ranch system of agriculture, to nevertheless implement trade policies that the agency's own economic studies show would cause considerable economic harm to America's family farmers and ranchers. Now that's quite shocking, so you're likely to say, I'm making this up. But here are a couple of concrete examples. In the USDA's 2013 economic analysis, published in support of its proposed rule to open the U.S. market to beef from Brazil, a country that poses a significant risk of introducing foot and mouth disease, the USDA determined that the proposal would cost U.S. cattle producers $165 million. Nevertheless, the agency decided to go forward with increasing the United States' risk of foot and mouth disease from Brazil, because the agency concluded the significant losses to cattle producers would be outweighed by gains to consumer welfare, as consumers would have more choices and cheaper beef. The USDA had earlier arrived at that same conclusion in 2012, when it further relaxed U.S. import standards for countries with a mad cow disease, stating that losses to cattle producers are outweighed by increased imports that increase consumer welfare by giving consumers more choices and cheaper beef. In other words, the consumer welfare experiment is a leading factor in the ongoing contraction of the U.S. cattle industry because it is now the pervasive standard used by policymakers throughout our government, from Congress to regulators and from antitrust issues to trade issues. And as we all know today, this standard persists even though consumers are now paying record prices for beef, while cattle producers continue suffering from low cattle prices. In other words, the consumer welfare experiment was an abject failure. Christopher Leonard was right. We must end the consumer welfare experiment before we have no more family farms and ranches to save. So please go to our website at r-calfusa.com to join in with us so we become strong enough to direct your U.S. cattle industry toward a more profitable and prosperous future for you and the next generations. Thank you and goodbye.